Every year, the government declared war on its own people. Not as punishment, not in response to rebellion, not because anything had happened, just every year, as policy, as calendar. The targets were not soldiers, they were farmers. They were the people who grew the food, built the houses, and made the entire civilization economically possible. And once a year, the state looked at those people and said, "You are our enemies. You may be killed. Any of our citizens who kills you will face no consequence, legal, religious, or otherwise." This happened in the most celebrated military society in Western history. This happened in Sparta. The same Sparta that Hollywood turned into the symbol of freedom. The same Sparta whose warriors we put on energy drink cans and gym logos and military recruitment posters. The same Sparta whose 300 soldiers we have retold in every medium available to us as the defining image of men who chose death over submission. They were free men who chose death over submission. The people who grew their food had no such choice. There is a version of Spartan history that appears in every school curriculum, every museum exhibit, every film adaptation produced in the last 50 years. It is coherent. It is inspiring. It features courage, sacrifice, brotherhood, and the defiance of impossible odds. It is also missing approximately 200,000 people. What those people were, what was done to them, what the 300 were actually protecting when they stood in that pass. That is the history that didn't make it into the film. And once you see it, the story of Thermopylae doesn't disappear. It just becomes a completely different story. The truth wasn't lost, it was traded, and the price was paid in blood. In 371 BC, a Theban general named Epaminondas destroyed the Spartan army at the Battle of Leuctra. Not weakened it, not pushed it back, destroyed it. The sacred band of Thebes, a unit of 150 pairs of male lovers bound by personal devotion, broke the Spartan formation in a single afternoon.
Enjoying the story so far? Subscribe to Untold History and keep discovering the past they never told.
The Spartans lost 400 of their 700 citizen soldiers in that engagement. Nearly 60% of their entire fighting class gone in one battle. Sparta never recovered. According to Paul Cartledge, Professor Emeritus of Greek Culture at Cambridge University and author of Sparta and Laconia, A Regional History, 1979, the citizen population of Sparta had been in catastrophic decline for over a century before Leuctra. At its peak, Sparta had roughly 8,000 full citizens, men who could vote, fight, and own land. By 371 BC, that number had collapsed to fewer than 1,500. Think about that. The city-state we mythologize as the ultimate military machine had fewer adult male citizens than a small town. The 300 at Thermopylae represented nearly a quarter of their available fighting force at the time. Not because Leonidas chose an elite detachment, but because that was close to what Sparta could field. The math alone should have ended the myth. But Leuctra didn't just end Spartan military dominance. It revealed a structural reality that Spartan propaganda had successfully hidden for 2 centuries. The entire system was fragile. It depended on a terror apparatus so extreme, so deliberately constructed, that the moment it cracked, the whole thing collapsed. Epaminondas marched into the Peloponnese after Leuctra and did something no foreign army had done in recorded Spartan history. He reached the outskirts of the city itself. The Spartans had no walls. They had always boasted that their men were their walls. But the men were gone. And the Helots, the enslaved population that outnumbered citizens 7-1, saw their opportunity. They rose. Not everywhere, not all at once, but enough. Epaminondas didn't need to burn Sparta. He just had to let its foundations see the light. So here is the question the history books don't ask. If the Spartan military system was this brittle, if it could be dismantled in one afternoon by a Theban general most people have never heard of, what exactly were those 300 men at Thermopylae dying to protect? But history has a way of leaving behind traces that don't fit the story we were told. Ask anyone what they know about Sparta, and the answer comes quickly. 300 warriors, a narrow pass, an empire stopped by sheer will. It's one of the most retold stories in Western history, taught in schools, carved into monuments, turned into a blockbuster film that grossed $456 million worldwide. Zack Snyder's 300, released in 2006, introduced a generation to Leonidas, to the hot gates, to the idea that a handful of men could hold the line against a force of millions through nothing but discipline, courage, and the refusal to kneel. The image is irresistible, and it wasn't invented by Hollywood. The Spartan myth is ancient. It was already being polished while the city still stood. Ancient historians, Herodotus, Thucydides, Plutarch, wrote about Sparta with a mixture of awe and unease that reads almost like modern fascination. Plutarch's Lives, written in the 1st century AD, gave us many of the defining Spartan anecdotes we still repeat. The mother who told her son to come back with his shield or on it. The boy who hid a fox under his cloak and let it eat his stomach rather than admit weakness. These stories circulated for centuries before anyone thought to question them. And why would they? The Spartan system, on its surface, is coherent, even admirable. Boys were taken from their families at age 7 and enrolled in the agoge, a state-run education system designed to produce soldiers. They slept in barracks. They competed constantly. They were underfed deliberately to sharpen their instinct for survival. They learned to endure cold, pain, hunger, and humiliation without complaint. By the time a Spartan boy became a man, he had been tested in ways that would break most people. The result, the official story tells us, was the finest infantry in the ancient world. Leonidas himself embodied this ideal. According to Herodotus's Histories, Book 7, he chose to stay at Thermopylae knowing the pass had been flanked. He dismissed most of the allied Greek forces. He kept the 300 Spartans and roughly 700 Thespians and 400 Thebans, who are rarely mentioned, to fight a rearguard action that would buy time for Greece. He died there. Every Spartan with him died there. And the story became eternal. What's remarkable is not that the story survived. It's that it survived completely intact, with no asterisks, no footnotes, no context about what Sparta actually was, or what those men were actually fighting to preserve. Because the moment you add that context, the story changes entirely. If you look at the surface, it makes sense. But the moment you scratch that surface, the whole thing starts to bleed. There is a word that appears in ancient sources, quietly, without emphasis, as if it were ordinary. Crypteia. It translates, roughly, as the secret thing. Plutarch describes it in Life of Lycurgus, section 28. The passage is short, clinical. He writes that the ephors, Sparta's ruling magistrates, would periodically send young men out into the countryside armed with daggers and minimal supplies. Their orders were to move by night, to hide by day, and to kill any helot they encountered who seemed physically strong or showed signs of leadership potential. This was not a punishment. This was not a response to rebellion. This was the graduation exercise. The Crypteia was the final stage of the agoge, the same training system we just described with admiration. The boys who survived years of hunger and cold and competition were sent out to murder enslaved people in the dark. Alone, without witnesses, as proof that they were ready to be Spartan citizens. Aristotle mentions the practice in Politics, Book 2. He doesn't dwell on it. He notes it the way you note an administrative detail. That tone, that complete absence of moral weight, is itself the evidence. Because what it tells us is that by the time these sources were written, the systematic murder of enslaved people by Spartan teenagers was so normalized, so structurally embedded in the society, that it didn't warrant explanation. It was simply what Sparta did. It was how Sparta worked. And here is the detail that should stop you entirely. According to Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, Book 4, the Spartan state had a formal practice of declaring war on the Helot population every single year. Not in response to uprisings, not as a reaction to specific events. Every year, at the start of the year, the ephors issued a formal declaration of war against their own enslaved workforce. The reason was legal, not military. Under Greek religious law, killing another person carried a spiritual pollution, a miasma, that required ritual cleansing. By declaring the Helots enemies of the state on an annual basis, Sparta ensured that any citizen who killed a Helot was legally killing an enemy combatant, not a person. No pollution, no consequence, no record. The bureaucracy of atrocity. The 300 men who died at Thermopylae were products of this system. They were trained inside it. They administered it. They went home to it. Or they would have, if they had come home. And the question that follows is one the myth was specifically designed to prevent you from asking. What exactly was the civilization they were defending? We aren't just looking at a mistake anymore. We are looking at a pattern. The Helots were not a small underclass. According to Herodotus's Histories, Book 9, the Spartan force at the Battle of Plataea in 479 BC, the land battle that finally ended the Persian invasion, included 5,000 Spartan citizen soldiers and 35,000 Helot attendants. 7 to 1. That ratio appears consistently across ancient sources. Cartledge's The Spartans, 2002, estimates the total Helot population at somewhere between 170,000 and 224,000 people at Sparta's peak, in a territory whose total citizen population never exceeded 10,000. This was not incidental. It was load-bearing. The entire Spartan military system, the agoge, the constant training, the professional soldier class, was only possible because the Helots did everything else. They farmed the land. They processed the food. They built and maintained the infrastructure. A Spartan citizen never needed to learn a trade, run a business, or grow his own food, because an enslaved person was legally obligated to do it for him. The 300 at Thermopylae could afford to be full-time warriors because roughly 2,100 Helots were working behind them. When Leonidas marched to the Hot Gates, he brought 300 Spartiates and an estimated 900 Helot attendants. They are mentioned once in Herodotus. Then they disappear from the story entirely. 900 people, erased in a single sentence. And this is where it gets interesting. The Helots were not from a foreign land. They were not prisoners of war brought from distant conquests. They were Greeks. Specifically, they were Messenians, the original inhabitants of the fertile region of Messenia that Sparta had invaded and conquered in the 8th century BC, approximately 720 BC, during the First Messenian War. Sparta didn't enslave foreigners. Sparta enslaved its neighbors, people who spoke the same language, worshipped the same gods, recognized the same heroes. And the Messenians remembered. According to Thucydides, the Helots revolted multiple times, most significantly in 464 BC, when a major earthquake struck Sparta and the Helots seized the opportunity. The uprising lasted, by some accounts, nearly a decade. Sparta was forced to appeal to Athens for military assistance to suppress it, the same Athens it would spend the next generation trying to destroy in the Peloponnesian War. The Athenians sent troops. Then they thought better of it. Then they sent them home. The relationship between Sparta and its enslaved population was not stable coexistence.
Enjoying the story so far? Subscribe to Untold History and keep discovering the past they never told.
It was permanent, managed terror. The Crypteia was not an aberration. It was maintenance. It was the annual calibration of fear required to keep a population 7 times larger than its captors from doing what logic suggested they should do. Sparta was not a military state that happened to have slaves. Sparta was a slave state that required a military to survive. Every year. That is the detail that doesn't leave. Every year, the ephors of Sparta, the 5 elected magistrates who held the highest civilian authority in the state, stood before their city and formally declared war on the people who grew their food, built their houses, and raised their children. Not because those people had done anything, not because there was a threat, because the law required it. Because without that annual declaration, killing a helot would carry spiritual consequence. And Spartans killed helots regularly enough that they needed the paperwork to be in order. The boys who survived the agoge, the men who stood at Thermopylae, the warriors whose names were recorded in stone while the helots who accompanied them were never named at all. They lived inside a system that declared war on human beings as a calendar event. Plutarch records that Spartans were forbidden from growing their own food. The land was worked by helots. The food was produced by helots. The leisure that made the training possible was purchased entirely with helot labor and helot fear. There is a Spartan saying that survived antiquity. It is attributed to various sources, but its meaning is consistent. We are the only free men in Greece. They believed it. That is perhaps the most disturbing part. Not the violence, not the system, but the absolute, unexamined certainty that a civilization built on the permanent terror of an enslaved majority was the purest expression of human freedom ever conceived. The myth didn't start with Hollywood. It started in Sparta. This isn't history. It's a warning. The Spartan myth did not die with Sparta. It was excavated, polished, and put back into circulation by people who found it useful. In the 18th century, French and British political philosophers began citing Sparta as a model of civic virtue, a society that had subordinated individual comfort to collective strength. Jean-Jacques Rousseau praised Spartan discipline in Discourse on the Sciences and Arts, 1750, as proof that moral greatness required the rejection of luxury and softness. He didn't mention the helots. Neither did most of his contemporaries. This was not accidental ignorance. The sources were available. Plutarch was widely read. Thucydides was a standard text in elite European education. The information about the Crypteia, the annual declaration of war, the 7-to-1 ratio, it was all there, in texts these men had studied. They chose the parts they wanted. That selective reading has consequences that reach directly into the present. The word Spartan today means austere, disciplined, uncompromising. It has been stripped entirely of its original context. There are Spartan race obstacle courses on 6 continents. There is a Spartan brand of water bottles, protein supplements, and workout programs. The U.S. military has used Spartan imagery in recruitment. Multiple political movements across the ideological spectrum have invoked Spartan identity as shorthand for strength, sacrifice, and civilizational seriousness. None of them mention the helots. And that absence is doing exactly what it was designed to do. Because the Spartan myth, in every era it has been revived, serves the same function. It provides a vocabulary of heroism that is deliberately detached from the economic and human machinery that made that heroism possible. It lets any group, a nation, a movement, a brand, claim the aesthetic of sacrifice without interrogating what or who the sacrifice was actually built on. This is not a uniquely Spartan problem. It is the problem of myth itself. Every society that has built its identity on a heroic founding narrative has made the same editorial decision Plutarch made. Include the shield wall. Remove the supply chain. Celebrate the warriors. Erase the people who fed them. The mechanism is always the same, and the result is always the same. A story clean enough to inspire, and incomplete enough to mislead. In 2006, when 300 was released, several historians publicly noted its historical inaccuracies. The exaggerated Persian numbers, the fantastical creature designs, the absence of the thespians who also died at the pass. These critiques were largely dismissed as pedantry. Missing from almost all of them was the more fundamental problem, that the film presented a slave state as the champion of freedom against tyranny, and no one in the mainstream conversation found that worth examining. The Persians in the film are depicted as decadent, monstrous, and servile. The Spartans are depicted as free men who choose death over submission. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, noted that the Persian army at Thermopylae included soldiers from dozens of nations, many of whom were fighting under compulsion, conscripted by imperial decree. The Spartans, by contrast, were volunteers, citizens, free men by the legal definition of their society. But that definition excluded, by design, the majority of the people living inside Spartan borders. The film got the aesthetics right. It got everything else backwards. And that reversal, freedom as the property of the few, terror as the foundation of order, myth as the mechanism that makes both invisible, is not a problem that belongs to ancient Greece. It is the operating system of every civilization that has ever needed its people to fight without asking too many questions. The Helots didn't get a movie. They rarely do. History isn't what happened. It's what we choose to remember and what we choose to forget. There is a question underneath all of this that the myth was built to prevent. Not, were the 300 brave? They were. Courage is real. It exists independently of the cause it serves, and the men who died at Thermopylae died with genuine conviction. That is not in dispute. The question is different. The question is, what does it mean that we chose this story? Out of everything ancient Greece produced, the mathematics, the philosophy, the architecture, the democratic experiments of Athens that directly shaped every Western constitution written in the last 3 centuries, we chose the story of 300 soldiers who died holding a pass for 3 days. We chose the story where the ending is a defeat. We chose the story where the hero dies. And we told it so many times, in so many forms, across so many centuries, that it stopped being a historical event and became something closer to a religion. A story that tells us what we are supposed to want to be. Disciplined, unyielding, willing to die for the group. Those are not neutral virtues. They are specific virtues. They are the virtues of a soldier, not a citizen. They are the virtues of a person who executes rather than questions, who endures rather than reforms, who finds meaning in sacrifice rather than in the examination of what the sacrifice is for. The Spartan myth does not ask you to think, it asks you to feel. And what it makes you feel, that surge of something in the chest when you see the shields locked together, when you hear, "Tonight we dine in hell," is real. The emotion is genuine. That's precisely why the myth is effective, and precisely why it requires examination. Because every generation that has revived the Spartan ideal has used that emotional charge to bypass a question. The French revolutionaries who admired Sparta's civic discipline were building a republic on the labor of colonial subjects they did not count as citizens. The 19th century European nationalists, who invoked Spartan sacrifice, were constructing racial hierarchies that required, as Sparta did, a permanent underclass to make the chosen people's freedom economically possible. The modern fitness brands and military recruitment campaigns that trade on Spartan imagery are selling an identity, hardness, selectness, the pride of being among the few, that depends entirely on there being a many who are not. The structure is always the same: a celebrated few, an invisible many, and a story told so well, so often, so cinematically, that the invisible many becomes simply the background. The Helots were the background of Thermopylae, and we have been remaking that film ever since. This is what myth does at its most sophisticated. It doesn't lie. It selects. It takes something real, the courage of those men, the cold of that pass, the weight of that decision, and it frames it so precisely, so perfectly, that everything outside the frame disappears. Not erased, just not shown. The Helots existed. The annual declaration of war existed. The Crypteia existed. The sources that document all of it are the same sources that gave us Leonidas. They were always there. We just kept choosing what to look at. That choice, the editorial decision made by every civilization about which stories to elevate and which to leave in the footnotes, is not made once. It is made continuously. It is made in curricula and in films and in the names we give our sports teams and our supplement brands and our political movements. It is being made right now. And the only way to interrupt it is to do what you just did. Look at the whole frame. Not just the shields, not just the pass, not just the 300. All of it. If the real cost of Thermopylae was hidden for 2,500 years, what other stories are we still only seeing in pieces? Tell me in the comments. I want to know which myth you think deserves this kind of examination next. Next week, we uncover the financial system that was built in secret on a private island and has been running the world ever since. The frame was always bigger than what they showed you.